Okay, everyone, this is the third part of Section 18 for History 231, dealing with the early Roman Empire between about 14 and 138 AD. And we've been talking a little bit about how the empire was run, how things worked in the empire. And the thing to keep in mind, again, is that during the Roman Republic, the Romans were conquering far and wide, and that meant their best talent was going towards conquest, whereas during the Roman Empire, they're not conquering so much anymore, and as a result, their efforts are going into administration. So how were the provinces administered outside of Italy and the center of the empire? Well, there's a couple of different things that we start to see here. Number one is that the Romans at first were not very good at administration. They were good at conquest, but not administration. And one of the problems was they tended to plunder the heck out of all the people they conquered, which of course just ticked everybody off and does not work in the long run. If you plunder people you conquer, you're just going to make them angry. This is what happened with the Assyrian Empire. You'll remember the Assyrians would plunder and plunder and plunder and plunder, and eventually the Assyrians were basically squashed by all sorts of people because they had just really ticked everybody off. So this is something that we're going to start seeing. We're starting to see emperors realize this, and they're realizing if we're going to stay in this for the long haul, we're going to have to do something different than just plundering everyone. So, for example, tax farming. One of the stupidest ideas in the history of the world is tax farming, and they finally started getting rid of that. And so this was a good idea here. But good emperors might be wise enough to not do stupid things. The trouble is when all the power is on one person, when one person has all the power, that person might be prone to do something really stupid that could affect a lot of people really quickly. And this is the trouble with centralizing too much power in one place. If the person you give the power to is smart, yes, things will work well. If they're an idiot, things are going to go south really fast. So bad emperors, say for example Nero. This guy didn't know what he was doing. He was incompetent. He wanted to be an artiste. He did not want to actually run an empire, but he wanted to have all the benefits of running an empire. And what this caused were various and sundry rebellions. Eventually people would rebel against the Romans, and this was expensive. All right? It was expensive in terms of human lives and expensive in terms of just the cost of having to send in the troops to put down the rebellion. A famous example of this is a queen named Boudica. And Boudica was brutalized by the Romans for no particular reason, and so she rebelled. All right? Massive rebellion. And guess what? 70,000 Romans and their friends were killed before the legions could be sent into England and put this down here. Right, and put this down. So that's an interesting problem that the Romans are going to have to figure out a way to get around. Okay, you cannot brutalize people too much and expect things to last. The Jewish rebellions are yet another example of this. When the Romans were nasty to the Jews kept rebelling, and it was a hugely expensive problem for the Romans to try and solve. So that is an important thing to keep in mind here. Now, the governors tended to have fairly small staffs. Communications were, of course, important, and so they had to build a road system. So you see a lot of roads. There are Roman roads all over the Mediterranean world today. I've actually walked on a Roman road. I have a picture of myself walking on a Roman road in Syria, of all places, and it was still there, all right? It was still there. It wasn't really being used anymore, but it was still there, and you could go marching around on it, and I did that. I had a nice picture of myself marching on this Roman road. So that was kind of a neat thing. But keep in mind, the roads are secondary. The main avenue of communication in the Roman Empire is by sea. That is to say, the Mediterranean Sea. Because the Mediterranean Sea is at the center of the Roman Empire, and it's really the thing that holds it together. So being able to sail over large distances by sea was a real benefit for the Romans. Now, the frontiers of the Roman Empire, of course, were always tricky. The big one, the long one, is the north, always up against those Germans and those people up in Europe, and there's no way the Romans can conquer all these people. So how do you deal with those folks on the other side of the frontier? And keep in mind, the Roman Empire did not have the kind of fixed borders that we see in countries today, which have been laid out by surveyors, right? No, they had much more flexible borders. People would go back and forth across the border all the time. And on the other side of the border in the north were going to be all these various German tribes. The Romans could never totally subjugate them. So how do you maintain control if these Germans might come crashing across the border from time to time? Well, what you do is you put legions up there. You put the legions in fixed camps, and those fixed camps are bases of operation from which you can lash back at the invading barbarians. And this is what they would do. They would go crash against the Germans and give them a bloody nose, and then they'd come home to their camp. Now, this had a number of effects, right? One of those effects, of course, is that the legions are much more stable now. They're much more stationary now. They're centered in certain places. More and more of the troops in the legions are not Romans, but in fact local, provincial, loyal groups, all right? And this is an important thing. I was in France a year or so ago, and we went and saw this really interesting place, and we saw this interesting movie where this guy, this Gaulish guy, had been a very barbarian sort of guy, but he'd aligned himself with the Romans, and then he had gone off and fought for the Romans and fought on their frontier, come back with a bunch of money, given it to his son, and over time his son went from being a Gaulish guy to a Roman guy. All right, he acted and dressed and spoke like a Roman. He became a very loyal Roman guy. And this is a really interesting effect of having these troops here, because each of these camps where these Romans are now stationed becomes a little center of Roman life and Roman culture. They speak Latin in there, all right? And so if you're a local and you want to take advantage of the economic opportunity of all of those Roman soldiers there who have a little bit of money, what you're going to do is learn Latin. You're going to learn how to get them to buy your stuff. All right? And this is a very common thing. Military troops, when they are stationed in places, are little islands of their own culture. We see this in Europe today, where American soldiers, ever since the Second World War, have been stationed in certain places in Europe, and they had little corners of American culture as a result, bringing American culture more and more to Europe, as we can see. So this is something that we start to see. And this leads to a very interesting process that we call Romanization. In other words, as time went by, more and more of the empire became more and more like Rome. Culturally, linguistically, it became more and more like Rome. The western half of the empire, pretty soon, pretty much everyone is going to be speaking Latin in this place. They're going to have more and more Roman culture. But it does go the other way as well. Some of these local practices are going to find their way into Rome, and they're going to affect the way the Romans are. So cultures evolve. They are always in a constant state of change. All right. Sometimes the changes are quick and sudden and big, as I expect the changes that come out of this coronavirus pandemic will be. There will be some really big social changes. I can't predict what they're going to be, but they will be there. They're going to be fast. But there's also slow, steady cultural change, and that is something else that we are seeing with these Romans. So a thing called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, settles in as the Romans settle down here, as the Romans settle down. And this, of course, is going to have a big impact. The local elites become increasingly Latinized, Romanized, and then the average persons will follow after that. There are a couple of exceptions. The big one are the Greeks. Greek culture survives. Now, this is a couple of reasons for this. Number one, Greek culture is really cool, really vibrant, and really strong. The Greeks had really neat culture, right? And the Greeks knew it. In fact, they were cultural snobs. They would look down their nose at those Latins. Those Romans aren't as cool as we are. And even though the Romans had conquered the Greeks liked to make sure everybody knew the Greeks were still cooler than the Romans. And so the Greek culture is preserved in this environment, and it was helped by the fact that the Romans themselves saw the Greeks as being cooler than they were, at least from cultural points of view. And as a result, we see this really interesting process of Romanization not really taking off in Greece, and increasingly the eastern half of the empire is more and more culturally dominated by Greek culture as opposed to Latin Roman culture in the West. And this is an important point, because it means that over time the empire is actually beginning to become almost two empires, one Greek-speaking in the east, one Latin-speaking in the west. Now, a fellow named Plutarch is the guy that I like to use as my poster child for this process of the survival of Greek culture. And here's the thing about Plutarch. Plutarch was Greek. And so he had the Greek snob attitude that we're better than everyone else because we're so smart. And he was, of course, very smart, as the Greeks were. So they had some right to be proud, absolutely, all right? But he was kind of a snob, too. And here's what he did. He was a biographer. Right? There are some people out there who love biographies. They love writing biographies. They love reading biographies. It's pretty cool. And biographies are a lot of fun, and there are a lot of interesting things to read. They're not quite history in the sense of a Thucydides, for example, but they are a form of historical study through the study of individual human lives. So here's what Plutarch would do. He would write the story, the biography, of some famous Roman, like, let's say, Julius Caesar. He would write the biography of Julius Caesar, and isn't Julius Caesar cool? And he'd tell you all about Julius Caesar, and that's really neat. And then, at the same time he wrote that and published that, he would publish a biography of Alexander the Great. Why? So he could remind the Romans that for every great Roman like Julius Caesar, there's a Greek guy who's even cooler. And this is what it did. This is what he did. So he would publish Roman lives, but then he would publish Greek lives along with them, just to kind of needle the Romans into remembering the Greeks are really cool. And many times the Greeks said, we're cooler than you are. And that was an interesting thing that our friend Plutarch does. All right? Now, there's another thing that happens with the Pax Romana, with the Roman peace, that is really quite important, and this is a valuable lesson for all of us here. The simple fact is this: for most of us and most of the world, peace is better than war. If you're in a constant state of conquest and war and fighting with your neighbors and smashing the heck out of each other, you're spending all your time and energy and money and lives doing that, which means you're not spending time working on anything else. So peace is good if you want to advance things like science, like medicine, like human knowledge of any kind. Peace is better than war. War is only good if you want to advance weapons development and things like that. Or coffin making, I suppose, does really well during wartime as well. So this is an important point. So we find during this time when the Romans were controlling the Greeks that the genius of Greek culture was now given the opportunity to expand and grow and do amazing things. And sure enough, it does. We see some amazing advances in science and other places during this time because the Romans were keeping the Greeks, well, from killing each other, which is what they had always done before. Now, this actually had happened during the Hellenistic period as well, as we have seen. The Hellenistic period also saw these powerful Greek kings keeping things under control. The old Spartan, Athens, Polis, Peloponnesian War disasters just weren't happening anymore. So the Greeks were now free to do their brilliant, brilliant cultural, scientific, and academic achievements. And one of the most important guys who does it during this period is a guy named Galen. And I've given Galen, along with Plutarch, a star. And here's what Galen basically did. He's a physician. And today, of course, with this terrible pandemic going on around us, we are all extra grateful to physicians. And I think we should all take a moment and thank physicians for doing what they do, keeping us all as safe as they can, and helping us get better when we get sick. And I'm always grateful to physicians. I've spent a lot of my life in doctors' offices. Believe me, it ain't any fun, but I'm glad they're there, and I'm grateful to physicians. All right? Even though I've not always had good physicians, I'm grateful for the possession of physicians because they do help keep us alive, especially in times like ours today. So let's be thankful to physicians. Next time you see a doctor, thank them. All right? But here's the thing. The doctor I'm talking about is Galen, and Galen is a major figure in the history of medicine. He wrote exhaustively on medical things. We have about 20,000 pages of his work that survives here. Extensive commentaries on previous physicians here, like including Hippocrates. The Hippocratic oath that physicians are supposed to take comes from him. All right? And so we find this really interesting thing. And I've always thought the funniest and most interesting thing about our friend Galen was he proved something that to me seems pretty obvious, but I'll tell you what it is anyway. He proved that the arteries do not hold air. Now, that's a no-brainer, right? If you cut yourself, air doesn't come out, blood comes out. In fact, let me give you some medical advice. And I'm not an MD, so this medical advice comes only because of my own experiences and what I've learned. Do not ever inject yourself with air. If you do inject yourself with air, you will die. You will have a stroke, and trust me, I've had a stroke. You don't want to have a stroke, and you will die. So do not inject yourself ever with air. All right? Galen proved that the arteries don't hold air. So yay, hooray, hurrah for Galen, who helped us out with that little tidbit of knowledge here. All right? Now, to the Romans, Greek literature, Greek art was seen as being in good taste. It was sort of highbrow art, highbrow literature. It's what snobby people liked to do here, all right? And this is an interesting sort of thing because we find still a lot of Greek writing and Greek culture in this period here. And so as people more and more over the empire, especially in the western part of the empire, shift from their local languages to Latin, Greek remains incredibly strong in the East and incredibly important in the East. Incredibly important in the East, and as a result of this, Greek culture not only survives, but it thrives during this period. All right, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. So your identity was tied to economics. This is not uncommon. We see this today. All right, we see this today. Identity is tied to economics here. And this meant, of course, if you were wealthy, what do you do with your money? Every culture has ways that wealthy people will deal with their money. In some cultures, being rich means you don't show off. You never show off your wealth. In other cultures, you do. Right? In other cultures, you do. And so we see this, and one of my favorite, well, in a sort of ironic way, shows that I ever saw was called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. And what they did was they went around and they showed people on their private yachts, and they showed people in their big mansions. And this guy, I think his name was Robin Leach, and he would talk about how wonderful this is to have a marble tub 6 feet by 20 feet, and it's so wonderful, blah, 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 blah. And he would show off how rich people lived. And Americans loved this stuff. So we like looking at rich people. Part of us maybe we want to be rich someday, all right? But part of it is just there's something about the opulence of rich people that Americans find absolutely fascinating, all right? As long as the rich people do not flaunt it. There are limits. There are limits to how much you are supposed to flaunt your wealth. And during this terrible crisis that we are in right now, I heard a story of a very, very rich guy, and he's sitting on his private yacht, and he sent out some kind of a tweet or something about how, oh my gosh, I hope everyone's okay. I'm sitting on my, massive, massive yacht, all safe and comfortable, and we're all in this together. Well, we're not all in this together. You're on a yacht, and I'm not, all right? So it is possible for the rich to go too far. It is possible for wealth to become distasteful, and that is something that can happen as well. So the question is, if you've got a lot of money, how should you spend that money? And that's a really interesting question, and every society has answers. For the Romans, here's how it worked. If you had a lot of money, the way to show off your wealth was to do nice things for your community. What you would do is build things for your community. You would build a new Colosseum, or you would build some new temple. You would build something really snazzy and snancy and wonderful, and everyone would say, hey, that Vedlerus guy, Haroldus Vedlerus guy, he built this really neat thing, and we're all enjoying it. Isn't he a great guy? And then, of course, your prestige goes up. Now, of course, Haroldus Vedlerus doesn't have any money, so he can't really do that, but, that's how it worked. So this was the notion here, all right? And this goes back to this old idea of the patron-client relationship. It's a very old idea in Rome. If you were a wealthy, powerful person, you would get clients, people who were poor. So if you're a patrician, you would get a bunch of plebeians. You would help them out, and they would help you out. And here's how it works, right? If your client needs a hand, you intervene to give them a hand. If you need something, they will give it to you. It's a scratch my back, scratch your back kind of a system where the rich guy helps the poor guy, and enough poor guys all get together and they help the rich guy. And this is how this worked in Roman culture. Now, I want to keep something else in mind, all right? This society, Roman society, did not have much of a middle class. And this is an important point. In the United States today, one of the major reasons for the success of the United States, and yes, for the success of American capitalism, has been that the United States has been able to create and maintain an extremely large middle class. And we've done it in large part because we pushed public education. We pushed public opportunities for everybody, or at least we tried. Now, that doesn't mean everyone's had opportunities. We have a terrible history of racism in this culture. We do have a problem where rich people get to send their kids to Yale and Harvard, and they get to have ins on good jobs and blah, 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 blah. So it's not like we are an egalitarian society. We're not even close, no. But we are closer than the Romans were, because we do have a middle class. They really didn't. There was virtually no middle class in ancient Rome. You were either rich or you were poor, and not much in between. And that is an important thing. And if that's the case and you're poor, getting a rich patron who will help you out in times of trouble becomes all the more important. All the more important. But even today, finding someone who can help you out is always a good thing. And this is why I always tell students, learn how to schmooze, learn how to network, learn how to get contacts and make friends. Because trust me, somewhere down the road, it will benefit you. You will pay off with it. And this is what the plebeians would do in Rome, and this is what we can do here in the United States. And keep in mind, we're a lot better off than they were because we do have a middle class. The Romans did not. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. But this brings us to the end of this particular lecture, and so I will wish you all well. Please all stay safe. This is very important in this day and age. Please stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.